It is just a huge honor for me today to be podcast interviewing Peter Almonte, Esquire. He's an attorney, practice broker, practice valuation specialist, consultant, author, and lecturer. With over 30 years' experience in practice transition, he and his associates have participated in over 3,000 practice transitions. I can't believe that. Peter has also been qualified as an expert witness and given testimony respecting valuation issues. He holds a Doctor of Law degree from Cornell University School of Law and is a graduate of Holy Cross Magna Cum Laude. He has been a guest lecturer at dental schools and dental conventions throughout the United States. Practice Exchange brings over 50 years of combined experience to the industry, with more than 3,000 professional practice transitions successfully completed. Their diversified group provides a full suite of dental and optometry practice transition services, including appraisals, brokerage services, financing, consulting, and transition coordinated services. We pride ourselves on the ability to put our clients' needs first and other professional expertise and guidance throughout the transition process. My gosh, I was trying to think of when I saw you last. It was before the pandemic in Scottsdale lecturing to a group. How long ago was that, and where was that at?
It was Scottsdale, Arizona, and I believe it was at the Radisson Hotel, and there were about 150 people. It was for the Practice Valuation Study Group.
And I have to hand it to you. You guys were geniuses because you were all preempting and expecting a mountain of transitions to come into the future. Do you remember what year that was?
I would say that the year you and I were both on the speaking program, and I think it was like around 2001, 2002.
It was that long ago, huh? But anyway, you know, I'm going to say again, this is not a commercial. You didn't pay me to come on the show. I didn't pay you to come on the show. I asked you to come on the show, and I'm very grateful that you come on the show because the pandemic has changed so much about your business. Do you agree with that or not agree?
Absolutely. I agree with you. Sure.
So, just the things I'm seeing on this side, I haven't sold one practice, let alone three. Well, I've sold a couple practices, but not 3,000. But the bottom line is I noticed that when we started Dental Town in 99, we started with free classified ads. It's a big part of Dental Town. There's always like 5,000 ads posted. But there's always about 1,000 practices for sale and 4,000 jobs posted available for young dentists. Now there's 2,000 practices for sale because all the 60-year-old dentists and over are saying, you know, I'm done with PPE. I'm out of here. And the 4,000 jobs is down to 1,000 jobs, and they're only DSOs. So now when you're coming out of school, it's like, you know, dentists, doctors, and lawyers aren't really good at taking orders. They prefer to give orders. So when they come out of school, they're either going to be taking orders at a DSO or they got to buy their own practice. And my gosh, these are crazy times. So again, I'll say it again. I graduated May 11 and signed my lease, got into an office with no money down. I rented 1,000 square foot. He said he wanted $15 a square foot for 3 years. I said, I'll give you $20 a square foot for 5 years, the extra money to do the build out. He said, fine. I went over to Healthco, which was the biggest equipment dealer of the day back then. And they loaded up my dental office and gave it to me on a 60-month, 5-year lease to own. So I opened up my office on a Thursday. It probably cost me 10 grand on credit cards and stuff. That was about it. And I opened up. And now, 30 years later, the kids, they're obviously smarter than we were when we got out of school. I had 26 encyclopedias that were printed in 1953, and they have Wikipedia with 75 million pages that were updated today. They're smarter, they eat better, they exercise more, but they come out of school and they believe that the holy grail is just get a job, and after a year they hate it and they get a different job, then a different job. By the time they're out of school, 5 years, they've had 5 different jobs. And the only reason they start their own practice or buy their own practice is because they're so miserable, they're so sick of working for someone else, they finally do it. Do you think the pandemic is going to kind of nudge them like maybe you're going to go get your own practice faster than before the pandemic?
Well, I think how the pandemic has had a major impact on the dentistry as it has in every facet of our lives today. When the pandemic first broke out in March of this year, and many states just shut down completely, uh, most practices were closed 2, 3 months. Some didn't open up and reopen until June or July. And during that period of time, during the shutdown, if you ask me, when do you think we get some kind of normalcy again? I would have said maybe a year and a half from now, from that point in time. But what happened, what we learned when the doctors started to reopen their offices, people who were in their middle 60s to 70s and were contemplating retirement in 2 or 3 years down the road, all of a sudden decided to accelerate their retirement, not wanting to go through everything to do with the safety protocols and with the risk to their own health, to their staff. So as a result of the pandemic, a lot of doctors in that age category decided to sell their practices. And what we have found is that younger dentists are interested in owning their own practice still. If they work for a DSO for 2 or 3 years, or they work in a private practice for 2 or 3 years, at some point in time, they become disillusioned. And maybe their goal was to be the master of their own destiny, to open their own practice. And what we've found since July, there's been more interest in practice sales. We've had a number of closings. We have a lot of year-end closings pending. And but the landscape has changed. In terms of the financing a dental practice, it's different than it was before the pandemic. Now what the lenders are looking for is they want to compare the year 2020 to the year 2019. So for example, they'll want to see what the practice was doing during the first 3 months of 2020 before it closed in March, and compare that to 2019 for that same period of time. The reason for that is they just want to see if that practice was on the same level, or if it was on a trajectory to increase revenues and production for 2020. And then what they want to look at, and this is relevant for not only the lenders, but for the buyers and the sellers, they want to compare month by month, 2020 to 2019, once the practice reopened. So for example, July of 2020 was the practice reopened. They'll want to compare what the practice did in 2019. And what we found with a lot of practices that we're working with, they were at about 50% that first month. And maybe August, the second month, they might have been at 75%. But most of the practice that we've been fortunate to work with, by the third month, by September, they were, many of them were at 100%, some were over 100%. And so we've seen that trajectory through October and November. The reason why it's relevant, because some lenders after the coronavirus shutdown decided not to lend at all, but there are lenders who are lending that we've worked with, and they'll compare from year to year, month to month. And if the practices in 2020 were at 80% of what they did in 2019, and the buyer's credit is good, you can still buy a dental practice and you can still sell your dental practice. And the really good practices, they've been at 100%, 113, 115% for October, November. And that gives people reassurance that there's a future for a young dentist to own a practice.
Now, in your 3,000 practice transitions that you've done in your career, were they mostly financed through one or two banks, or were those done over a dozen different banks?
Well, when I initially started, the sellers themselves had to finance the practice
Nice.
sale.
Nice.
Goes
You just
back
gave
that
away
far
your
back.
age. You just gave away your age.
Yeah, yeah. And but typically the lenders we're lending 100% of the sale price, and we dealt with a variety of lenders around the United States. But maybe there was a half a dozen, maybe 8 to 9 that were in the business very competitively that you could always go to and obtain financing for your clients. So we generally, when we work with a buyer, we give them 3 or 4 bank references that they can contact. But today, since the pandemic, we've done loans, some with the SBA, but we've done it with banks all over the country. We had closings in Tennessee, Wisconsin, and Texas, and
I think of
local banks.
I think of the big banks, like the coastal banks, like U.S. Bank, Wells Fargo, J.P. Morgan, Bank of America. Or do those 4, are those the lion's shares of all your loans?
In years past, Bank of America was very big, probably the biggest. But today, there are other lenders that are doing more business, that we've done more business with in 2020 than Bank of America, Wells Fargo.
Is Live Oak one of them?
Live Oak is one, TD Bank, People's Bank, U.S. Guarantee, and others.
And by the way, kids, if you're young, please don't tell old Dennis how upset you are that the interest rate on your loan was 8% when the interest rate on my first house was 14%. Remember, when I got out of high school in 1980, interest rates was 21%.
Yeah.
And now when the kid walks up to you and says, "Well, I'm not going to pay 5% on a mortgage," it's like, okay, you can't say that.
Let me say this. Some of the closings we've had, the interest rate is like 3.15, 3.05, 3.45, and I understand they might be even lower.
Holy moly. I mean, when
Yeah.
in the 80s, you could have 2 dentists buy a practice in the same zip code, and the different interest rates they might be paying on their loan might have varied by 3.5 or 4%.
That's right.
I mean, these are crazy times. We have two things we're talking to. We're talking about an old guy selling a practice and a young person buying a practice. I don't know where you want to start, but I'm going to start with this. This is what I try to do on Dentistry Uncensored is not find what everybody sees and agrees with. I try to find where there's a difference on how they treat, think, whatever. And I think this industry was pretty much started by Alan F. Thornburg, the founder of AFCO down in Atlanta, Georgia. And he also pioneered this dual representation thing where he was one of these Southern boys said, I'm not going to screw around. I'm going to represent both, buy, sell. We're going to just get her done. And I know that I don't believe so much in right or wrong, but trade-offs. And I notice a lot of people, a lot of lawyers and practice brokers, that's the first thing they get stuck up on, and they get hinged up on that. Some will say, well, come on, is this lawyer representing Howard or Peter? I mean, so I know he's a colleague of yours. I know we all know each other, and I love Alan, and his daughter Alana. I love him. But what are your thoughts on dual representation versus each side having their own attorney?
Well, let me answer it this way. As an attorney, I could only represent the seller or the buyer. I couldn't represent both because they have different interests that could sometimes conflict. And it's a question of, is your representation compromised? But I think when we talk about dual representation, when I think AFCO does dual representation, it's not in a legal sense. It's as a practice broker or consultant where you're giving advice to both the seller and the buyer. We don't do dual representation. I have never done that. We represent the seller as a practice broker and consultant, but we will work with the buyer and we will work with the seller because we view our role as a facilitator to help facilitate the differences the disagreements between the seller and the buyer, and to find a resolution that's mutually satisfactory to both the seller and the buyer. That's what the role of that we view as brokers and consultants with Practice Exchange. And we just charge the seller, and we don't charge the seller a penny until the closing. Everything that we do, the appraisal, the cash flows, the whatever negotiations there are, the coordinating the transition, helping the attorneys and the seller and buyer resolve issues. We don't charge a fee until the time of closing. That's when we get paid.
Okay, so let me see if I heard that right, because I'm a dentist, you're an attorney. So are you saying a lawyer under their profession cannot do dual representation? That legally that's not a thing. It's something a broker could do or a real estate agent could do, but not something an attorney could do?
Well,
Is that fair to say?
I wouldn't advise an attorney to do it because I think there's always the question of whether your legal opinion is compromised by the fact that you're representing people with opposing interests.
Nice, well said. So do you want to start with the old man selling or the young kid buying?
We can start with the old man or woman selling.
Well, if they're old, they're mostly men.
Well,
if they're young, they're half and half.
They're matured. They're matured.
So the old guy, I mean, let's go to real estate. I mean, even in Phoenix, Arizona, where it's 110 degrees for half a year, you got to have a swimming pool. But every real estate agent will tell you, it says, if you put $1 into putting a pool in your house, it will not raise the value enough to get your dollar back. Do not do that. Some things improve the value. A lot of older guys are sitting there thinking, okay, I want to sell my practice this year, next year, a couple of years. What are dollars that old doc can put into his office that is going to help, that's going to get $1.10 or $1.15 or $1.25 out when he goes to sell it? What's a return on investment, and what is a waste of time?
Well, I think, buying new equipment in the last year or two of ownership, I think is money that's not necessarily well spent because you might get the depreciated value of that at the time of sale. What I have found over the years is that I wouldn't advise the sellers to make dramatic changes to their practice, like go out and buy all new equipment necessarily. But what I would do would be some cosmetic changes so that when somebody walks into your office, their first impression is a lasting one. And maybe I might tell people to, paint the walls, recarpet the flooring, or change the flooring if it's old and dark and doesn't look very good or presentable. That cosmetic change will help market the practice and make it more saleable.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, I've seen dentists put in all new Dentrix, and then the person who buys it wants to throw it away and get open dental. I mean, so a lot of this stuff is crazy. Another thing that's really scaring the kids is this. This is what they say to me all the time. They say, "Well, I'm in Parsons, Kansas, but I know I'm not in New York or Manhattan or any big city, but I heard a big DSO's coming our way. The DSO is this big bad boogeyman. So you got demographics and you got DSOs, and what I'm hearing is that the DSOs do not want to go to the rural because they can't find young docs to work for them. And so I see the best values for the money are usually 2 hours away from wherever Southwest Airlines takes off. If you can get 2 hours away from a Southwest airline gate, you're usually one dentist to 3,000 or 4,000. You're usually, I mean, it's like shooting fish in a barrel. I mean, that's how you go fishing with a sawed-off 12 gun in a barrel. But they're millennials, and they come out of school single. In 1945, they got married early. They had 5.5 kids. Now they get married a full decade later. So they come out, they're single. You got better odds of finding a primate mate in big old Phoenix than you do in Little Eloy with 1,000 people. So is rural just dead and dying and going away? What does rural look like to you? The DSOs won't go there. The single people won't go there. Who the hell's going to serve half the country?
Well, let me say this, as far as rural communities are concerned, what we find, yeah, the typical young buyer wants a more suburban inner city practice. Every now and then we'll find somebody who might have been born in a rural area and loves that lifestyle and prefers to own a practice in a rural area. It's much tougher sell. We had a tremendously successful practice in a rural area of a mid-Atlantic state. Um, but everybody who looked at it, they loved the practice, they loved the building, but they said, it's too remote. I'm not going to be able to get associates here, just like you say. And so that's a real problem. You have a limited number of people who would have potentially interest in a rural practice. And basically what we have found, people who were brought up in rural areas and love that lifestyle. We had a fellow brought up in Missouri, and bought a practice in Wisconsin because he loved fishing all the time. And there was not another practice for 50 miles. And when we found that buyer, the seller said to me, look, my wife and I both feel, Peter, if we want to sell this practice to this young man, because if he doesn't buy it, we both feel nobody's going to buy it. So, and it just worked out for them, but it is a very tough sell.
Yeah, and I have to put a shout out to why I love Jack Dillenberg, the dean of the dental school that started at MIT, and why I hate U.S. and World Report is because when I go to small towns in Arizona, I'll go talking to them and I'll say, well, what is your biggest constraint to growing your business here in Kingman, Arizona? And they'll say, well, I can't get a mechanical engineer. I mean, I could hire 3 of them today. And I'll say, well, why can't you get one? And he goes, oh, because ASU, they only accept on the grade point average. So it's all a bunch of urban kids that were born there, and no one will go 3 hours away to Kingman. And every time some kid from high school here applies to ASU, they have like a 2.8 average, so they don't get in. And it's like, my gosh, Jack Dillenberg saw that with the Indian reservations. He's like, why are there no Native American Indian dentists on the reservation? And they said, well, they didn't make the cutoff for the, and Jack said, forget it. Anybody who applies to dental school from a Navajo Indian reservation, they're going to get in. And now because if I was Navajo and spoke Navajo, I wouldn't want to go to me. I'd want to go to someone. If I was in Iran and I broke my tooth, I would find the first dentist I could find that was fluent in English. I mean, I don't want to raise my hand or any of that stuff. And so these universities are so shallow that all they want is to make the U.S. and World Report and the best entrance class and all that stuff, and they don't care a thing about their constituents. And half the tax dollars come from the rural, and they get no respect. And these deans at ASU, if some kid applies to mechanical engineering school and he's from Kingman, Arizona, and they said they've been 3 short for 5 years, well, then the dean should say, well, send me 3 kids and they're all in mechanical engineering school. But that's not the way it works, and that's unfortunate. But I think it's just so cool to see how many Native American Indian dentists are now practicing in Bullhead City. When I went up to Bullhead City the first time, it was a bunch of Irish kids. You know what I mean? It was there was no Navajos up there. So yeah, and then also the people in the rural. I want to tell you that I believe that. Well, I got to go back to the book, Only the Paranoid Survive by Andy Grove, the founder of Intel. I remember reading his book, and everybody was saying, well, Andy, how do you always pick the next technology the first? You do it, Cisco does it. Bill Gates was 5 years late on the internet. I mean, he didn't even see it, but man, Andy Grove always saw it. And he goes, well, it's just math. He goes, we track everybody's sales every month. And if on any month, and especially 100% on any quarter, if somebody jumps out 10x in sales, There's a real damn good reason, and we throw everything on that, and it's always the winner. Well, there's about to be another 10x change in America, and that is the transportation as a service. I mean, the average car is you only use the average car 4% of the week. So basically, 4% of 168 hours. It always sits in your driveway. You got maintenance and gas and taxes and all this crap like that. And I'm in Phoenix, where Google started their Waymo project, and the 5-year project is already done. Nobody died in the 5-year study they did the driverless cars. 100 Americans a day were killed by a human behind the wheel, and not one was killed by Waymo, because that driverless car, I mean, it doesn't know how to drink and drive. And I'm telling you, they ordered 80,000 driverless taxis. I can't even get one. I tried to get one today, and they're all sold out, because it's just a driverless car, so you don't have to deal with the Uber driver. You don't have to talk and all that. So a driverless car. So when you're out there in the rural and you're 2 hours away and you want to live in Scottsdale, dude, you're not even 1 year away from having that car show up at your house at 6 o'clock, and all you do is put on you're still in your pajamas and your robe, and you just go crawl back into bed in your driverless car and fall back to sleep. And 2 hours later, ding, you've arrived. And then another thing I'm seeing they're doing is they're making bigger driverless cars so you can have a staff meeting. So there's a table with 6 or so chairs, or your computer does. So on your way back from home, you leave your home and your kids are at home and you got an hour commute. Well, you won't care if the commute's an hour. You won't care if it's 2 hours, because you're going to get all your stuff done. And then when you walk in, you're done. And so I think the rural, and when you look at the fact that if the average American switched from owning their car to transportation as a service, the average American would save $6,900 a year, and that is a 10x. That is a 10x move. So I think urban is going to come back. Rural is going to come back with driverless cars. I mean, my God, say you're on a fishing trip. Well, you wouldn't have to quit drinking at noon and then leave at sun. I mean, you could drink up till the sun went down, and then you're in a driverless car. You go all the way back home. I mean, it's going to be a huge game changer. But right now, dentists in the rural, I tell them, I mean, since the pandemic, I've seen 10 dentists walk away from their practice in the rural. I mean, it'd been for sale for a year before the pandemic. They didn't even get a bite during the pandemic. And then I see these kids, and I'm like, my gosh, it's only an hour away, and you have no competition. You wouldn't have to take insurance. You no marketing, no advertising. You're like, nope, I'm going to practice in Scottsdale. And I'm like, dude, live in Scottsdale, but don't practice in Scottsdale. So another thing with the seller, what is the lag time? If I'm thinking, if I'm sitting at home with my spouse and we're sitting there thinking, yeah, we want to be out of this practice by next spring. What is the lag time between a dentist calling you and getting a check and being done with it?
That will vary, Howard, with the seller's objectives and the kind of practice that they have, and their expected retirement date. Part of our analysis when you were talking about the driverless cars is we do a demographic study of the area where the practice is located. So we look into not only the educational background, the values of homes, the wages, the number of people in that community that have health insurance, people who have no health insurance. So we try to get as much information about the community as we can to help a prospective buyer make a judgment about that practice, whether that would interest them or not. As far as the sellers are concerned, obviously the more profitable the practice, the more favorable demographics of the practice. You could have a grade A practice in a suburban city area and a grade A practice, the same kind of a practice, as you say, in a rural area. And the grade A practice in a suburban or rural area can sell quickly, It could sell within a few months, and it may take a number of months to close it. So you may find a buyer within 60 days, and then it'll take another 3 or 4 months to close the transaction. So technically, somebody could be out in 6 months. In most cases, it'll take longer than that.
So, a lot of dentists, older guys, have and I don't want to slam anybody. I don't want to be that guy, but some of them just morally, after 40 years of dentistry, they're not buying into DSOs, but they kind of feel like if they put their practice up for sale, that's going to be the only one that's buying. And then a lot of the buyers don't want to buy that old man's office because he knew he was thinking he might be selling to a DSO, but the young kid's afraid to buy it because he thinks that the urban half of America is going to be overran by DSOs. So talk about the DSO. What is the factor in the DSO in from when you sold your first practice 3,000 ago to now? How was DSOs entered and taken?
Well, DSOs, Howard, they have more of a share of the market than they did, say, 10 years ago. I think maybe 10 years ago, it was less than 7% of the market. Today, it's greater.
What do you think it is?
Maybe around 20% of the new sales. And there are some people who prefer to sell to a DSO because they can continue to work. If somebody wants to work another 3 or 4 or 5 years after the closing, but they're tired of the management, dealing with the staff and getting rid of all of that responsibility, that might work for them, a DSO. With a DSO, you might get a higher price, but some of that sale price will be held in escrow, conditioned upon your completing the work employment requirements. But, for a young dentist to own their own practice as opposed to working for a DSO, working for another practice, for a young dentist to own their own practice, they can achieve the greatest amount of financial success as a dentist, as a practice owner, whether it's a solo owner or whether it's in a partnership. So the people that we deal with, they realize that. And we have like a rule of thumb when we're dealing with buyers. Will the buyer earn more money as a practice owner after paying the overhead of the practice and paying the debt service than they do as an associate in the practice, in another practice? And if the answer is yes, then that's a great incentive for them to move on and become the owner of their own practice.
Wow, that was a lot. Gosh,
and let me say this, if I could just add this point. For the seller, it's also great to sell to an individual dentist because they can get all their money up front, as opposed to having some of it structured over a period of time and conditioned upon their employment in the practice. Typically, a young individual dentist would like to have the seller stay on for a transition, but then after that, the seller can retire completely, and the young dentist will do just fine.
So DSOs. To me, it looks like they have there's 6,000 graduates a year, and the graduates all work for them for about 5. So 6 times 5 is 30,000, and that's about the pool they work with. If you remember Orthodontic Centers of America, the reason Lazarus made it to the New York Stock Exchange with $1 billion valuations because he was buying up all these orthodontic offices, the biggest ones that he could find, and he could find them because the ones worth 2 to 4 million weren't selling, because most people looking to buy a practice, it's $1 million or less. So he saw this huge glut of monster huge dental offices, buying them up. New York Stock Exchange loved it. But the selling orthodontists had to stay 3 years, and they all only stayed 3 years. And at 3 years, they all quit, and then they replaced it with some young orthodontic kid out of school who couldn't do those numbers. And the whole thing was a disaster, and it was a fall from grace, and we wrote all that. Well, now the DSOs are back. And again, I think they got 30,000 kids to work with. I don't. Do you when you talk to them, they say boldly on this podcasts, they'll say, well, we're not going rural, but man, we're going to get all the urban. We're going to completely take the urban market. You said that they're buying 20% of new practice sales growth. Stan Bergman says about the same thing. They got about, he says 17 to 18% of the doctors, and they buy about 19% of the supply. So it's about a fifth. But that fifth is just in the urban, so half is out. So they got a fifth, but it's in the urban. How big do you think DSOs are going to get? What do you think this market's going to look like in 10, 20 years? Put on your futurist. Do you need to go put on your tinfoil hat when you start making predictions into the future?
No, I don't think so. I don't think so. They're here to stay. They're a force to be reckoned with, and it's a question of the seller's priorities and the buyer's priorities. It's different from what it was 10 years ago. They have a bigger presence today. But I think, people like going to their dentist, their family dentist, and that has a lot to say for the staying power of individual dentists owning their own practices. With a DSO, there's a turnaround. Well, we also find that young people that are buying practice, they've worked with a DSO for 2 or 3 years, and it's just not for them, and they'd rather be the owner of their own practice. But I think long term they're here to stay.
And what do you think they do better, which is why they're here to stay? And what do you think they do better than the solo practicing dentist? What do you think is the DSO advantage from scale? And what do you think the individual dentist advantage is from the opposite of scale?
Well, let me say this. I can't speak so much to the DSOs because, frankly, we don't work with them very much. They prefer to work without a broker. But what I can say about the staying power of individual dentists, we're working with a number of practices where the owner and maybe an associate do around $2 million a year, and they have a very high net. So on their own, they can still achieve financial success and financial independence. And if somebody wants to be the master of their own destiny, they go to undergraduate school, then dental school, and then residency. Some of those people prefer to be the master of their own destiny. I know when they get out of dental school, they have a lot of debt. And sometimes that's a reason for people to go with a DSO and work for them. But we see so many successful individual practice owners who prefer not to sell to a DSO. And those are the people that we deal with.
Yeah, so don't tell me about how high your interest rate is when it's 6, 7, 8%. When me and my gosh, Peter and I remember 21%. Did you remember 21, or was it 19.5?
In 1980, with Jimmy Carter, President Carter. Yeah, it was at least 18% for residential mortgages and higher for business loans.
Well, I actually give Jimmy Carter the best. I give him credit for this because nobody would do it. And he was a smart guy. And he asked the New York Fed, why do we have these cycles of boom and bust and inflation? And he said, it's the inflation. And he goes, well, how do you get rid of the inflation? He goes, because none of you politicians will do it. And he said, well, how do you get rid of it? And he goes, we'll jack interest rates up until it's dead. And who's ever in office will take the fall for it, and no one will do it. And Jimmy Carter took a knee. He prayed on it. He said, is this what's best for the country? And then he gave Paul Volcker, the New York Fed, a green light. And Volcker came in and killed inflation in 1980, and Jimmy Carter still takes the blame for that to this day. My MBA teacher, if you blame that on Carter, oh my God, you would have got a lecture with him 1 foot from your face and saliva coming out of his mouth. Mm-hmm. He thought Jimmy Carter took a hit, and Paul Volcker. But anyway, that's all history and all that stuff. I want to go back to the DSOs. I don't like the term DSO. To me, it's group practice. When I opened up my office in '87, going from 120 classmates to all by myself, I was lonely. I hired an associate in like 6 months, and I was so dumb. I got someone just as young and dumb as me right out of school. I wasn't smart enough to get the oldest guy I could find that wanted a job to teach me something. And then I started Dental Town for the same reason. I mean, it was 1999, and I got really sick of going on to ESPN and being able to talk about football, but I couldn't go talk to any dentist about a root canal. And then everybody at my home and family and sisters and dad, if I ask them a dental question, they're all Catholic. They'd say, well, I'll say a prayer for it, or I'll say a rosary for it. And it's like, I don't want a rosary. I want to know what bonding agent to use. You know what I mean? So, that whole thing was those special needs and all that kind of stuff. But so group practice, I guarantee they're healthier dentists. I mean, let's say you fall off the cliff and you start drinking, not spitting out the Listerine, and you're just falling apart. When you're the only dentist in there, the staff, they don't know what to do. But in a group practice, you failed, you can't find the canal. Let me go look. They find it. You can't get out a root tip. It's better. And when they go from in a small town, Google and Facebook have sucked up all the advertising dollars. So radio and print and direct mail's almost dead. And they look at a town, they'll be in a town and they'll say, okay, I'm just on the south side. But if we put another group practice on the northeast west, we could do billboards, radios. I mean, in Arizona, you can get a half-hour radio ad for like $200. Middle of the night. I mean, look at Clear Choice. I mean, they're doing implant commercials, hour-long infomercials every night for no money almost. And so I love group practice. I'm in a group practice. I've been in a group practice since day one. Robert Savage was my first. Teresa Murphy. It's so much more enjoyable. And that first level of scale, like say, when you can go to 3 locations, 4 locations, my gosh, you can have someone full-time in HR, accounting, marketing, and that now you're the dentist. And it's really hard just to learn how to do root canal fillings and crowns. But to add on that marketing and website and HR, it's too many hats to wear and they get burned out. The question is this. I tell them I've never had an original idea. I mean, I became a dentist. Guess what? My neighbor, Kenny Anderson, was a dentist. He's still a dentist. I stole that idea from my next door neighbor. My website, I stole that from ESPN. I mean, I've never had an original idea, but I say steal from the big guys. Well, the big guys, when they set up 3 or 4 locations, like Aspen, every one of them's named Aspen. Heartland, it's kind of like Kroger. You don't know that Dillon's and Fry's or Hinky Dinky are all owned by Kroger. So Walmart, Costco, Aspen, national brand, Kroger, Heartland, individual brands. And a lot of these dentists are asking on Dental Town, they're saying, okay, I'm going to set up a second location and maybe a third location. Should I, for branding, should they all be the same name? What if I have an associate in there 5 years and he wants to buy the practice and I named it Howard Dinky's Dental Office, and so branding wise, what do you think about the different strategies between Heartland, every one of them that the patient would never know, and Aspen, every one of them knows it's Aspen? What's the pros and cons of that?
Well, I think that branding is a good idea for obviously for a DSO, but we have even individual doctors who own 4 or 5 practices, and their intent is to own more. And they're also branding their practices with a name that is common throughout the state in which they're buying practices. So, it does serve a useful purpose for a larger group. And I hear what you're saying about group practices, and we work with a lot of group practices. We have, a 9 membership partnership group where 2 of the partners are retiring, and we're finding buyers to replace those 2 partners. And that practice has several locations, and it's worked successfully for them. But we work primarily with individual practices who are selling their practices, or a group practice where a partner in that group practice is selling. So yes, even for a smaller practice, if you have more than 1 location, branding is excellent. If you have 1 location, getting the name of your practice out in the marketplace. When I started 31 years ago, I advertised in dental journals. that was the medium that we used to advertise. For a number of years now, there's no advertising. It's not necessary to advertise in dental journals. Everything is in social media platforms, and that's what our marketing department does. We have 3 full-time people that run that department, and all they do all day long is find sellers throughout the United States and find buyers to match with them. And an individual, whether you're a DSO, a group practice, or a solo practice, branding your practice so people identify it as a certain kind of practice, and to gain notoriety in an affirmative way, that's fine. That's a great idea.
And right now in Dental Town, we don't charge for ads, but right now in Dental Town, there are 5,033 classified ads. Dental equipment is 563. Personal stuff is 60, but dental practices for sale, 2,554. That's never been over 1,000 before Corona. Jobs available, 1,300. It's always been 4,000 plus. It just went back up over 1,000, March, April, May, June. That thing dropped down to under 1,000. But I want to ask you something more personal. Again, I was telling the younger kids, never go whine about your interest rate to an old person that was alive in 1980. The other thing is partnerships. I mean, your student loan debt. Like a lot of people complain about their $400,000 student loan debt, and it seems like a lot of money until they get divorced, and then they owe $1 million. And these partnerships, I think dentistry's jaded because people who sell partnerships have put such a positive spin and light on it. It's kind of like when you go call the priest and tell him you don't get married. He didn't say, "What are you drinking? You need to sober up and get that crazy." You know what I mean? It just seems like everybody talks about how great a partnership is, but what percent of dentists get divorced? What percent of partnerships break up? And from everything I've seen, the practice breakup costs more than divorce. I mean, I know several dentists who they sold half their practice to a kid and got for $500,000, and then it fell apart. And 3 years later, they started suing each other, and it was tied up in courts for 2 years for another $200,000 or $300,000 in legal fees, and then he had to give the $500,000 back plus legal fees. So he sold a practice for $500,000. He had to give back the $500,000 plus pay $200 legal fees plus his. I mean, I've seen some nightmares, and the reason I think it is because when you get divorced, you got kids. You're not going to go to war with the kid's mother. You got your moms. You're just like just let's just be nice and make this go away. But my God, when you get divorced with a dentist that you don't have sex with, you don't sleep with, you don't know his mom, you don't have any social glues. Gosh, some of these dentists, they just go nuclear on each other for years. So what is the objective risk of a partnership with a dentist? In your 30 years, do you think most of them work out? Do you think it's the same as marriage, 50-50? What's your thoughts on marrying a dentist that you don't sleep with?
Well, let me say this. I think, like a group practice, like a partnership, is for a certain kind of individual that likes to share responsibilities, that likes to have different experts in different areas of expertise. And that works in a partnership. It also works if they each have different responsibilities. And over the years, we've seen very successful partnerships. And it is more challenging as a transition consultant to transition a partnership, to transition one doctor out and somebody else in. Oftentimes what we'll do is make an arrangement where one will buy the other out. But if they're relatively the same age, that's not going to happen. So that's where they call us in and we will look for someone. Generally, it works out well, but I think you have to have agreements for a buyout in the event of death, retirement, permanent disability. And the buyout has to be based on a formula that they all agree is fair and reasonable. So when we've helped create partnerships or we help sell a partnership interest, that's something that's paramount to make it work, to make the partnership work. So I think I have to say this. In 31 years of doing practice transitions, we've never had one practice fail. I'm sorry, one out of over 3,000 where the buyer defaulted on their loan. And that's because they had marital problems, not only with the wife, but with the mother-in-law, and they had a little drug problem beside that. In a partnership, I'm not aware of any partnership deals we've done where there's been an adversary relationship down the road. But I think the key to a successful group practice or partnership practice is that shared responsibilities, shared respect, and an admiration for the people that you work with.
Well, you have your mother-in-law, father-in-law, son-in-law, daughter-in-law, but your wife is the law. So that is them. But you're what I kind of heard you saying is maybe what I'm seeing is two people, that can fall apart. I got to tell you a story in St. Louis, and I don't like to tell the story because nobody will believe it except in St. Louis. I was giving a seminar in St. Louis, and it had just started, and I noticed I was trying to lecture, and two police are at the back of the door, and the lady that was checking in is pointing, and this cop walks down and motions to the guy, and the guy stands up and comes out. He turns him around, handcuffs him, walks him out, and we're just like, oh, never seen that before. You know what it was? Him and his partner had a fight the night before. He shot him in the office, went home, had dinner, went to bed, woke up, met his staff at my office, and that guy was still shot, and I'm just like, holy moly. But what I heard you saying is maybe it's a lot more stressful with two than it is with like 3 or 4 or 5. If there's like 5 guys, you're big enough scale, you got a strong office manager, you got a lot of systems. Is that kind of right? That maybe you reach 3, 4, or 5, you got enough scale where partnerships do a lot better than it's just the two of you?
Yeah, I think I would agree with you on that because I think you share the responsibilities as far as management of the practice, but then you have different avenues of expertise in terms of dentistry that you're doing different procedures. And so you can rely on that person for what they do. And it does create a larger income stream. So for the person who prefers to be in a group and share responsibilities, that can work well for them. For somebody who prefers to be the master of their own destiny and dictate whatever happens in their office, then that's the way they would go as a solo practitioner.
I agree that DSOs are, they do a lot of things better than general dentists. I mean, they get the better locations, they get the better marketing because they're scale. So their marketing is done by someone that only does marketing, like Dental Town. I mean, I got a guy. I got a 2-person marketing team that only does marketing, and that's all they do. Well, some dentists can't wear a hat on 2 nights a week and compete with my team on that. But I think a lot of it is psychological. I think a lot of dentists are just tired of managing. They're tired of managing staff, finance, marketing. I think a lot of dentists are just tired of that. There's too many hats to wear. Do you see a lot of people tired of managing?
Well, I would agree with you, Howard. I think, when someone contacts us that they're ready to sell their practice, if you ask them what's brought you to this place and time, and they will, the first reason is management, dealing with the staff. But let me say this, I think they get tired of the business end of it before they get tired of the dentistry. And that's what generally is the motivating factor in their deciding to sell their practice at any particular time. And like I said earlier, because of the pandemic, people who were contemplating retirement 2 or 3 years down the road have accelerated their timeline to the present.
The other question they're always going to ask, it's kind of a tribal thing. Like if you really sit back and look at Homo sapien, I mean, the first 100,000 years, it's all in Southern Africa. That's where the most genetic diversity is. And genetic diversity means something, meaning that, say, a normal species is a bowl of M&Ms. But if just two green M&Ms leave and go to Europe and a yellow one goes to Asia or things like that, there's less diversity. We obviously all were in Africa for 100,000, and as they met their future mother-in-laws, they just kept spreading out, spreading out. Now they're all the way from Australia to Argentina. I mean, sapien obviously doesn't like to be around a lot of people. When you look at their life, a third of it's asleep, but 2/3 of it's in their house, and that's either like 20% alone and another 20% with a spouse, or a couple of children or whatever. People are very stressful to sapien. They like to be alone. They don't like to be with a bunch of other people, and it's very, very stressful for them. And my gosh, it's the craziest thing. And then when they go into dentistry, yeah, they complain about root canals, fillings, and crowns. But every time I poll them, what stresses you out the most? It's just people. It's either going to be their staff, their patients, their wife, their kids. It's just people are the greatest thing about life. I couldn't imagine being born and being the only person alive on Gilligan's Island. That must be very confusing. I wouldn't even know what to make of it. I mean, could you imagine being born on Gilligan's Island, no other people your whole life? You'd just be thinking, what the hell's going on here? So the people are the best part about the world, and they're all the stressful part about the world. So anything you can do to increase your people skills. And dentists are overtrained in math and calculus and geometry and trig, and they just need to read more anthropology, sociology, and get that bad attitude about those movies. Like a lot of people say, I'm not going to go watch that. I'd rather watch a TED Talk or a documentary. Yeah, and that's why you're so stressed out by people. I reset my mind to say I'm going to go see all these stupid movies like Harry Loves Sally or Sleepless in Seattle, or these shows trying to develop the more human side of this relationship. Your patients are completely irrational. And I get it, man. People are people. They're the biggest challenge. But I'll tell you what, you learn the people business, it's going to make you a hell of a lot more money than learning geometry. Would you say right now is a buyer's market for the old selling dentist, or is it a buyer's market for the young kids buying, or is it a seller's market for the old guys? Who's got the upper hand in this current market, 2020, in the middle of a pandemic?
That's a very interesting question, because a lot of practices were shut down 2.5 to 3.5 months. And, what all the medical experts are saying, December, January, and February could be a very challenging time for us. But what we look at when we're dealing with a practice transition is how is that practice recovered since it reopened after the coronavirus hit. If it's doing 100%, 110%, 115% of what it did the same month the prior year, it's moving in the right direction. It shows that practice is coming back strong. And lenders will finance a practice sale where the practice is showing that kind of return on a monthly basis since the pandemic. So I don't know whether I can say the buyer has any advantage or the seller has an advantage. A good practice will sell even today. I don't know about the future. It's possible that some closings may be delayed because of the coronavirus until that vaccine comes out. But buyers want to buy a practice today because the interest rates are so low. They will never be as low as they are today. So that's an incentive for them to buy a practice. And as I say, a lot of sellers, they're ready to retire now, and some who were planning in the future have accelerated their retirement. I haven't seen buyers taking advantage of sellers or sellers taking advantage of buyers during this year 2020.
I don't think a lot of dentists, they have so many rules of thumb because humans always start first with what they want to believe, then they fill in the blanks saying, I'm going to sell my practice for $1 million, and I'm going to do this. Okay, first of all, you're not going to get $1 million. It'll be $750,000, and then you got a 10% broker's fee, and then you got taxes. Is it a pretty good rule of thumb that if you sell your office for $1 after taxes and broker's fees, you're down to 50 cents?
No, I think because when you sell a practice, you allocate the sale price for different tax purposes. And generally, the bulk of the allocation is on the goodwill, maybe 80, 90%. And right now, the capital gains tax is 15, 20%. So it's a great, as opposed to paying ordinary income. So the sellers can net a significant amount of money after taxes and the brokerage fee, which is deductible, by the way.
I got to ask you a question, which there's no reason in the world you should answer. You should just tell me next. But I know my homies, and I know I know at least 10% of them are thinking, why the hell do you need a broker? Why don't you just sell it yourself? And what do you say to that guy? He's like, dude, I can do, I'm a dentist. Come on. I don't need no one. Why do I need a broker?
Well, I think, obviously you could sell it yourself, but you're educated as, I don't mean you in particular, because you have a lot of traits that maybe some other dentists don't have, but the average dentist, the typical dentist, they've been educated to become the most proficient dentist they become. That's their area of expertise. That's like I may be a lawyer, but if I try to floss my own teeth or pull my own tooth, I'm gonna be in trouble. What we find when dentists try to sell and buy, try to talk to each other and negotiate the terms of the deal, rarely does it end successfully, because if there's a disagreement, now then there's a potential for a grudge between the seller and buyer. But the advantage of having a broker consultant and our practice exchange, we have not only brokers, but we have lawyers, tax attorneys, CPAs, business experts who work with us. And so we will help the person come up with the price, analyze the practice, come up with an analysis or an appraisal that the buyers will accept, that the banks will accept, and facilitate that for them. We'll do cash flow projections for the buyers to show them what they can potentially earn in this practice if they were to buy it after paying overhead and debt service. We help with the transaction, every aspect of it. So and we help the lawyers resolve issues. We'll help the accountant with the tax allocation. We'll help coordinate the transition. So we help with every aspect of the transaction. So for a seller, they're going to, just like you would go to a dentist to take care of a dental need, a broker consultant can take care of every aspect of the transaction for the seller to make it financially rewarding for them. And generally, the seller would get a higher price with a practice broker or consultant than if they were to sell it on their own.
I see this so often, this post on Dental Town, it just drives me crazy. But I mean, what does Jimi Hendrix, Bob Marley, Sonny Bono, Pablo Picasso, Michael Jackson, Prince, Aretha Franklin, what do they all have in common?
I think they're all dead.
They're all dead, and they died without a will. And damn it to hell, there's always a dentist dying, and he doesn't have a will, and the wife is calling and freaking out. I mean, he doesn't have a will. There's no trust. There's no nothing. And I'm like, really, Prince? I mean, Prince?
Yeah, that's tragic.
My God, how do you own a jet and not a will? I mean, my gosh. I mean, so anyway, a lot of dentists don't know what to do because they're so here's a master strategy that's so obvious. When I was growing up and having a practice, I was shocked the first time I met some guy that had a practice that was doing like 3 or 4 million, one location, taking home $1 million. What's the biggest net income dentist you've ever seen in your career, gross and net, where a dentist is netting a certain amount?
Yeah, I think definitely one. He was doing about $5.5 million a year. He had several associates in the practice, and he had a Las Vegas theme in the office, so it was very unique. And he was netting about 2.6 million a year
In one location.
in one location.
I know, man. So many times I'll be talking to some young dentists. I'll say, well, what's your goals? And they'll say, Howard, seriously, in 10 years, I'd like to own 5 offices. And I'm like, well, first of all, why would you want to have 5 locations, 5 rents, 5 mortgages, 5 everything? Here's a guy doing $5 million in one building. So what the hell is the 5 from? I mean, if you said you want to go from netting $1 to $100 to $1 million, that makes sense. But 5 locations, how is locations even enter a goal? So every time that's a unique strategy where you got some freak of genetic nature. It's kind of like the only 2 guys I know that played in 2 sports. I mean, Bo Jackson and Deion Sanders. I mean, first you have to win the genetic lottery, and then you got to be the hardest working man in town. So that guy might be unique, tall, dark, handsome. He's got some. But when it's just a common, hardworking, average Joe Harry that does it, it's always they went to a small town and there were 10 dentists. And every 5 years, the old guy would retire. But instead of standing there waiting for a 65-year-old to sell it to some highly energetic 25-year-old, they'd go over there and buy the practice. And then usually that guy who sold didn't realize 10% broker's fee, taxes, and that the next year his wife would want a new couch, probably just for the dog and more pillows, so they want to come back to work. And then a lot of these guys they bought from end up working 1 or 2 days a week until they die. And so they were the 10th office in a town of 10,000. And then you come back 25 years later and there's 4 dental practices in that town, and 5 of those dentists work in there, and the guy's taking home $1.5 million a year. And so mergers and acquisitions is just the backbone of Wall Street. Again, when I was born, the average age of the average publicly traded company on the S&P 500 was a senior citizen over 65. Now, the average company on the S&P 500 isn't even old enough to drink beer. They're under 20. And in 10 years, the average company is not even going to be 10 years. And so I highly recommend, it was really nice practicing with that old badger across the street. He didn't do anything new. He was closed 3 days a week. He was unlisted. He didn't market. And then you just sat there doing nothing. And then he sold to some young, hungry person with kids and all that kind of stuff. But sometimes they looking at this and they get a phone call from a crying wife. Harry died. Hell, I don't even know what to do. He doesn't have a trust. He doesn't have a will. And the dentist is thinking, okay, every day, 8 people are going to be told they don't come in for a cleaning, for a recall. So in 6 months, everybody's been told he's dead and we're gone. What do you do in a case like that? Is that practice going to be worth almost equipment only in 6 months? Is this something you got to do in 30 days? And if this dentist doesn't have a trust or a will, you're an attorney doing this forever. If that dentist doesn't have a trust or a will, he's Aretha Franklin and Prince. Do you just recommend, dude, walk, go find something else? This is a nightmare.
Well, I've written an article on transition in a dental practice in the event of death. And over the years, I've had somebody who was injured in an automobile accident in Lincoln Center, New York City, and couldn't practice anymore. And we've had dentists who have passed away. And in some cases, dentists will have a group of dentists in their community where they agree to sub for each other in the event of disability or death. But nobody or typically plans for dying. When that happens, you have to move quickly as soon as you can, because each day that practice loses value. You're not going to get the same value for it that you would have gotten had he been alive and was selling it as he was ready to retire. But each day it loses value. Unfortunately, what happens when there's no planning, the spouse, the children, the mother, they have no idea what they should be doing. And they'll talk to everybody that they know. And it only makes it much more difficult for them to come to a resolution that they've got to move quickly. The longer they wait, 6 months, if it's not sold within 30 days, it's you probably will end up getting nothing for it.
You know who the most ironic person who died without a will is? I mean, just total irony. Abraham Lincoln.
Honest Abe.
Honest Abe was a lawyer, and he
Hmm.
died without a will. That was a so yeah, crazy crazy times. This one is, there's I always think math and geometry and trig. That's the easiest thing in the world because it's exact. The hardest thing in the world is people, and everybody when they talk about the human tragedy of what happened, it was how the staff found out, or that they didn't tell the staff, or the assistant quit just because doc didn't even tell her, or whatever. It's so emotional. What is your father son advice on telling the staff?
Typically, we advise not to say anything to the staff until you have a signed purchase and sale agreement, until the buyer's financing has been approved. If there's a lease involved, that the lease has been signed, and that the buyer's due diligence has been completed, so that all the conditions that the buyer would have to closing have been satisfied and have been removed. And then we have a closing date set. Then I might tell them a week to 2 weeks before the closing, but not before then.
And why? What is the rationale behind all
Well,
this?
our concern is that if you tell the staff early on in your determination that you're going to retire, before you even have a buyer, the staff will become concerned about their job security, and they may decide to leave the practice and work with someone else that they know is going to be around for a longer period of time. That's one reason. The second reason would be that the staff can't keep secrets. They'll tell their spouse, and they'll get out in the community. And if the patients find out that the seller is going to retire, they may decide to leave the practice and go to another dentist. Whereas if you do it in an orderly transition, you notify the staff at the appropriate time, you introduce them to the new owner, you send letters to the patients, you call the patients, for those who are coming for early visits, tell them the good news. And as you promote it for what it is, it's a very positive experience for the seller, for the staff, for the patients, and for the buyer. But it should be done in an orderly fashion.
It should be done in an orderly fashion. Okay, so let's so we've been talking about the old guy. Shall we switch to the young person?
Sure, absolutely.
All right, let's switch to that young person. So it seems like I'll just talk about things that seem to always be on their mind. Number one is they go in there, and old man Dennis, he graduated 40 years ago. He's done a bunch of dentistry. They don't think it's clinically acceptable. They want to redo everything this guy's done in 40 years. And of course, they want the selling doctor to pay for it. Is clinical, you go to McDonald's, it's a Big Mac, fry, and a Coke. When a young person buys a dental office, what are his Big Mac, fry, and a Coke top 3 problems that he experienced from buying this practice from an old guy? Is the quality of the dentistry one of them, or what seems to be the big issues?
Well, let me say this. I think first and foremost, what we find is that when a young dentist buys a practice, within a year or 2 years max, they will be producing more dentistry than the retiring dentist did, and they will generate higher revenues, even in the most successful practices. I think in terms of what the 3 most important issues are, one would be bonding with the staff and making the staff realize their relevance to the practice, and that it's a team effort, and that you're going to depend on them to introduce you to the patients and to work with you so that we can all achieve success with this practice. So that would be an issue that they would have to deal with. The second issue would be maybe modernizing some of the equipment. They work with the latest technology in dental school, and that may be missing in this practice. So that may be another issue that they would want to address. And the third issue is putting their imprint on the practice, as opposed to the seller being respected and revered, but the seller is no longer in the practice, and now it's the buyer's practice. So the same, the buyer is purchasing the goodwill. That's the biggest asset of the sale that they're buying. So they want to maximize the potential for that goodwill. So they want to transfer the seller's goodwill to the buyer. And the buyer, that they have to make an effort to earn that respect with the patients and develop their own personal rapport with the patients. So it's a question of getting acquainted with the patients, the staff, and working with them as a team until you become established in the practice.
All right. And so on practice acquisitions, seller wants to stay on as an associate. That, God, isn't that just an obviously really good thing?
Well, it depends on the size of the practice. With a decent sized practice where they have 1 or 2 associates in the practice at the present time, yeah, and you might want the seller to remain and work in the practice. And if the seller wants to remain, that will help with the production and maintain the production and the revenues of the practice. So that could be very helpful. But at the same time, the seller's going to be working to transition their goodwill over to you. So it really depends. Some practices that aren't big enough, where the seller's been a sole practitioner his entire career, and the production and revenues demonstrate that. So that seller would stay for a short period of time to help with the transition, make the introductions, and then maybe after 30, 60 days, they might exit the practice completely.
So you know what I was saying about mergers and acquisition. I mean, you're in Rhode Island. How if you got in a car and just drove on the interstate, how long would it take you to get to Wall Street from Rhode Island, from where you're at? Where you at, Providence?
Providence, 2 hours and 45 minutes.
Okay, I mean, what percent of Wall Street is M&A activity? I mean, it's just huge. So if you're a dentist and you see Wall Street and you see this is just the deal. I mean, why hire a stranger associate when it's an old man? He's part of this community. He's been living here, going to church and schools, and I mean, it's just great. How would you solicit nearby dental offices? I mean, do you just, if you say, why did you send me this letter? Do you just say, because I thought I saw a liver spot? Is that a service you would do if somebody was in a Salina, Kansas, and there's like 40 dentists, and can someone just call a practice broker and say, hey, can you see if there's any old guys that want some M&A activity?
Our marketing team, they'll contact every dentist in the state of Kansas, and they will email or contact them through some social media platform and make contact with that dentist. And likewise, they'll do the same with buyers, that they'll recruit buyers from all over the United States for a particular practice, regardless of where it's located. They start out within a 25-mile radius, then they extended their market to a 50-mile radius, and then they extended outside the state into other communities and other areas. And we also have on our website, buyers register on our website to get information about practice availability. And when they register on the website, once they're registered, they will get an email every time notification of a new listing that's been posted in whatever state that practice may be located.
And that website is
www.practice-exchange.com.
Okay, say that again. That's a
www.practice-exchange.com.
Nice. When you start analyzing a practice for sale and you start doing the numbers, and you sold 3,000, how often when you're analyzing the practice do you find a history of embezzlement that doc didn't even know about?
Well, that's not one of our purposes to find embezzlement. We wouldn't necessarily find it. Um, what we look for, we will look at the practice tax returns. We'll look at profit and loss statements prepared by their accountant. We'll look at production reports. We'll look at production reports per provider. We'll look at collection reports. We'll look at aging accounts receivables. How well do they collect their receivables? We'll look at the demographics of the community. We'll look at the lease situation for the practice. We look at a variety of factors so that we can make the most informed judgment we can about that particular practice.
So do you think it's more of a problem or not as big of a problem as some dentists worry about?
As embezzlement,
Yeah.
yeah, that's not something that we deal with, Howard, but
I mean, do you hear about it a lot or not?
yeah, we hear about it from time to time where an office manager or bookkeeper has embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars. And unfortunately, generally, it's a gambling problem.
Really, gambling problem?
A gambling problem.
Huh. I'm gonna have to, that is amazing. Okay, now I can't believe we went over an hour, and like say I it's my most fun hour to talk to an attorney, and I get billed $400 an hour. My gosh, this is fun. I don't want it to stop. So I know that's what my homie's thinking. He's got a question. How much does it cost an hour to call you? What if he's listening to you right now and he says, I got a unique situation. How does he contact you, and what does something like that cost to talk?
It doesn't cost him anything to talk to any person with Practice Exchange because we want to find out what their circumstances are, what their objectives are, and ascertain how we can best assist them to successfully accomplish their objectives. So it's kind of a getting acquainted problem, so they can pick our brain for a while. So that for those two reasons, that we learn about them and their objectives, and we can ascertain how we can help them. And as I say, we don't charge any fee until the closing. So we can do a mountain of work. If we don't sell the practice, it's gratis. It ends up being gratis. But obviously,
so how do you like
we
him
sell
to
most of
contact?
them.
How do you like to be contacted? Do you prefer email, phone call? What do you like?
Sure, I can give you my email address. It's peter@practice-exchange.com.
Okay, now I'm going to ask you the question. I know you're going to hate, but we've been over an hour, so I know you hate this, but every dentist I know has a rule of thumb on how to value a practice, and they all believe it. It's 1 year's gross, it's 1 year's net. It's always a one variable rule of thumb. What would you say that one variable rule of thumb is for a practice valuation, and does it even exist?
Well, I think, if somebody can get 1 year's gross, I'm sure that would be their objective. What we look at is the income stream. What is the average adjusted income, net income or profit to the seller over the last 3 years? And we will consider the owner's compensation, pension contributions, continuing education expense, health insurance, other miscellaneous expenses the key is if they're not incidental to the operation of the practice. And then we'll come up with a weighted net income over a 3-year period with the most weight to the most current year. And then we use a multiplier of anywhere from 1 to 2 times 2. And then we value the equipment, and we put a number on the supplies and the accounts receivables to come up with a total value for the practice. And we'll do cash flow projections to demonstrate what a potential buyer could earn if they were to buy this practice at the price that we appraised it at.
I forgot when I was going on a rant how humans have been spreading out their whole life, and they spend a third of it asleep, 2/3 of it at home. they've shown 100,000 years of archaeological evidence that they don't like to live in density. They like to spread out. And I didn't even close with my point. And that is, that's why they like to own their land and building. And so my question to you is, in 3,000 practices sold in your career, how many of them come with land and building? And I have mixed signals, because one of the most important people in my childhood was Dan Carney, the founder of Pizza Hut, and he couldn't stand real estate. He just wanted the pizza business. He just couldn't care less about it. He said, "I'm not a real estate agent. I sell pizza." And he says he hated real estate. And then there was Sam Walton, who, when he wrote his autobiography, Made in America, him and Helen got screwed a couple times on a lease, and they said they'll never do it again. How much of owning the land and building is a hormonal, tribal part of being a human? I mean, when I let my dog out, the first thing he does is goes and marks the whole damn yard. And so, and the bottom line is tough, because I'm like, okay, well, maybe your business would do better by renting next to this, in this commercial area. And then a lot of them say, "Well, I'm not going to rent. I mean, I'm 30 years old. I'm not going to rent till I'm 70. I'm not going to rent for 40 years." So then they go show you where they went. I'm like, wow, man, the renting place, you had visibility from a 4-lane intersection. Now you own everything, and it takes a MapQuest to find your office. What do you advise? I mean, you're doing two things. You're selling a business, and then you're selling a real estate. And Grant Cardone's a real estate expert. You're a dentist. I mean, are you a dentist, and you should buy a dental practice and focus on the dentistry? How do you justify two separate specialties?
Right. Well, let me say this. The real estate is utilized in conjunction with the practice. Without the practice, the dentist wouldn't have need for the real estate. But depending on the cash flow of the practice, what we look at is what the buyer would pay in rent over a period of years, and what would they pay on a mortgage, particularly with the rates where they are today, the interest rates. If it's a great location and a beautiful office, large enough that they can expand if they desire to in the future, then and if it cash flows, rather than pay rent, if they buy the real estate, then when they 30, 35 years down the road, when they're ready to retire and sell their practice, they can sell the real estate, and now they have another asset in addition to the practice that they're selling. So I look at it as also good estate planning for a young dentist getting started.
I know I can't answer this question, but that's just the kind of guy I am.
You're going to ask it anyway.
I'm going to ask it anyway. The ADA's getting into this business, and I've been looking at I can remember when the ADA had 200 employees. Now they're 500 employees. I mean, they just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and they're coming out in all kinds of deals. What did you think when the ADA a couple of years ago started getting into practice transitions? Do you think they'll have a unique selling proposition and get a big piece of this market, or do you think or do you think they're in over their head, or what are your thoughts about that?
Well, I think this is America, and anybody who likes to get in any kind of a business, that's their right to do so. I remember when I started 30 years ago, I was an attorney doing practice transitions. And when I got into the brokerage end of the business, some fellow who was in the business before me was very upset with me that I got into the brokerage business. And, since I've been in this business, accountants have gotten into this business. Other lawyers have gotten into this business. Bankers that I've dealt with have gotten into this business as well. And so I think if you feel that it's something you can make a contribution and that you can be good at it and help your clients achieve their transition objectives, that's your right to do it. If the ADA feels they have a particular niche, more power to them.
I'm going to give a rant that I've believed for a long time. I still believe it, and feel free on my own show to just rip it apart and say you're dumber than a rock. But for me, I mean, comparing buying a dental office to real estate. Well, if I was a single man who was 70, I'd buy a one bedroom or two bedroom house. If I was married and had six kids, I'd buy a big house. But it really doesn't matter if you buy a small house or a big house because if I buy a $100,000 house in 10 years, I'll sell a $100,000 house. If I buy a $400,000 house in 10 years, I'll get my money back. And I always see a dentist with a big family. Say he's got five kids, and he comes to town. He buys a practice, and this one's too much, and this one's too much, and he buys this little thing. I'm like, dude, you got a stay-home spouse. You got five kids. Why didn't you buy a bigger income stream? And the first thing he says naturally is, well, I didn't want to spend that much money. I don't think they realize they're buying a machine. Like, if you need a car that goes 100 miles an hour, you don't buy a go-kart. You don't buy a mini bike. If you have big needs, you buy a big practice. And and some of these dentists that are sole providers, stay-home spouses, 4, 5, 6 kids, they need big income. Do you think they should buy a bigger practice since they have bigger cash flow needs?
Well, I think the practice should be something that you're comfortable with. The size practice should be something that you're comfortable with. Some people will think big and they'll pursue that and they will accomplish it. Some people don't think so big. They think a lot smaller. They may not have the self-confidence to buy a bigger practice. But I think, like these young dentists, they're buying practices that gross $1 million, that gross $2 million. They obviously feel confident that they can operate that kind of a practice and be successful at it. And if the real estate is a plus to the practice, then they will buy the real estate as well.
Interesting. And here's the value that I've seen. In fact, I was just talking to my buddy this the other day, but here's the bad thing. Everything Peter's talking about is all the legal stuff, but just being a dentist, here's where I seem bad. A dentist sells $1 million practice, and the dentist looks at it and says, well, all he does is crown and bridge. Anybody can do all that, but he doesn't realize these are all full mouth cases, and that selling dentist was good looking, on his feet, good with people, shook their hands, looked them in the eyes, and he could sell big case dentistry all day long. And then this little geometry geek buys the practice. He doesn't communicate. He blah, 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 blah. And he buys an office for $1 million that last year did 1.2 million. And the first year it falls to 650. Now look at the other side. Then here's the other side. I've seen this, and the best guy in the world ever was in Palm Springs. He's the smartest dentist I ever met in my life. He found some 70-year-old guy, didn't do crown and bridge. All he did is amalgams, patched everything with amalgams, just patch. Selling his practice for like $350. It had 4 chairs, all run down, it was all old. He just goes in there. Every single day, 4 senior citizens would call because some MODBL amalgam just completely fell apart. And then they just come down and he'd prep it, make a temporary and a crown, $1,000. I mean, the guy did 4 single unit crowns a day, Monday through Friday for 30 years. I mean, it's like the best time to plant a tree was 30 years ago. And to you guys out there placing MODBL amalgams today, God bless. I love you. What you're doing for the next generation of dentists is just planting all these trees. And so I would be more interested in saying, oh, wow, this guy's selling his office for $1, but he places implants and I don't. And this guy's selling his practice for $1, and he refers out all of his molar endo, and I do molar endo. So you just have to know, not just can you do the dentistry the old man did, can you sell the dentistry the old man did? Can you present the treatment plan the old man did? Because if you can do everything the old guy did, and then add Invisalign or molar endo or, God forbid, pediatric dentistry, you're buying $1 and it's already worth $2. I'd want to know how many dollars is this guy referring out. And then the other disaster that I've seen, this is the third disaster, and I'll let you weigh in all these. I don't even know if I'm asking a question. I'm just showing you my rant and seeing what your 30 years expertise is. Then the other one is they'll go into a small town. Again, dentistry, you sell the invisible. I know what my iPhone is. I know what a Subway sandwich is. I mean, I'm a health food fanatic, and I know right on the bag, that these are thinny chips. I eat them just to be thinner. I mean, but in dentistry, we sell the invisible. And when I tell Peter that he has 4 cavities, I mean, what is he gonna do? Google it? I mean, we're down to trust. And then this dentist goes into a small town, buys Dr. Good's office, been there for 30 years, sees all these women that have been there for 20, 30 years, and they've got $1 raise every time the earth went around the sun. And he said, this is ridiculous. I'm going to fire all these $25 an hour women and replace them with a bunch of $15. And he goes and he fires all the old people. And then everyone in the town like, oh, yeah, when Peter sold his practice, the new guy, I heard all the staff quit. But they go in there, and old dentists have high labor because of that. I mean, the great thing about keeping long-term staff is you make all these relationships. What was that movie, that bar, Friends? You want to go where everybody knows your name,
Yeah.
you know, Cheers or Bar Friends or whatever. And you want that, but if they just keep getting $1 raise every year, I mean, their labor gets high. But man, what do you think about when you go buy an office, you have all that reputation, and then you clean out all that long-term staff, and they don't know what went down. They don't know what your labor costs are. They don't know what was going on, but they do know this. They went to Peter for 30 years, absolutely loved him, and his girl Cheryl and his girl Friday, they were the best girls ever. And I mean, God, when Peter sold that office, every girl in that office quit. And then they believe deep down inside it's because you're a hack. You're a horrible dentist, a horrible person, and then trying to change those beliefs in your community by posting on Facebook and Snapchat and Instagram, you know. So what do you think about those 3 rants all tied in?
Well, I think obviously the buyer would be wise if they're buying the practice for whatever reasons they're buying it for, and particularly because they respect the seller and they want to transfer his goodwill to themselves. So the smart people, they will, the first few months they'll ingratiate themselves to the staff and the patients. They want to get to know the patients so that after 2 or 3 visits, the patients will develop a trust in them. They've got to build up the same trust that the seller had for all those years. And then they, you're right, it's a people business. It's the way they deal with patients and how the patients respect them. They have to earn that respect. So you just can't go in there overnight and then gangbusters, you're going to change everything. Otherwise, you lose the staff and you lose patients. So, and I think that's one thing that we drill in prospective buys, and we work with them on that as part of the transition. And our experience has been that the buyers will, within a period of time, will make it a bigger practice than what they bought when and the price they paid for it. They'll increase the production, they'll increase the revenues, and they'll increase the bottom line. So you have to have the self-confidence to buy a practice, and you have to have the self-confidence that you can take that practice to another level.
Last question. A lot of young
Sure.
kids, they see that ESQ behind your name, Esquire, London, they're barristers. A lot of them are JDs. What's the difference between an Esquire, a JD, a barrister? What is that a Rhode Island Northeast thing more common than LA?
Cornell, they gave a Doctor of Jurisprudence degrees. Some law schools, it's an LLB degree, but the JD is Doctor of Jurisprudence. You're still, whatever the degree is, you're still a lawyer.
So JD is Doctor
Of Jurisprudence, yeah.
And what is Esquire?
I don't know if that's an LLB.
Because you're an ESQ, right?
Well, that's lawyers would use that. Typically, I do Peter Almonte JD because that's my degree. Okay.
Kyle, let's do that because last time we did one with a ESQ, that was the number 1 question from the podcast. I know it's a, and by the way, dentist, I think it's a travesty that I'm sitting here in Phoenix. Everything starts way back on the East Coast. We're nothing out here. Only 1/4 of Americans live west of the Mississippi, and I just think it's horrible that everybody's confused between the difference between a DDS and a DMD, and to be getting that question for 30 years. We should have one eye on the patient and one eye on cost, and use our God-given brain and talent to drive down costs so that more Americans have the freedom to afford their teeth. And why the hell do they all have to be confused? Because they see it with MDs and DOs.
Mhm.
And when they ask me, what's the difference in a DDS and a DMD? I mean, I'm a DDS. I just tell them, well, a DMD isn't a real dentist. I mean, that's just a wannabe fake guy. I think that's true. Is that true? But anyway, I'm just kidding. But yeah, I wish dentists would get on the same page with that, because it's not fair to grandma who's stressed out saying, well, my dentist back in North Dakota was a DDS and this guy out here is a DMD, and what the hell's going on? And that's not the patient's job. I mean, if we're all dentists, the consumer should see homogeny. They shouldn't be confused by this. But hey, Peter, seriously, man, it was great to see you when we were out here in Scottsdale, and it's so nice of you to share 30 years experience on 3,000 sales to my homies. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Howard, it's my pleasure. It's good to see you again.
Oh, good to see you, man. And have a rocking hot day, and we'll talk to you later.
Sounds great.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye now.